Welcome to the full sewing tutorial for the Florence pattern, a romantic and feminine design that's sure to become a staple in your handmade wardrobe. Whether you're dreaming of a breezy everyday top or a floaty dress for a special occasion, Florence gives you options. And best of all, it's available in girls, tween, and misses sizing. This pattern features a soft V neckline and an empire length bodice with a comfortable elastic back panel for a flattering and forgiving fit. You can choose a clean minimalist silhouette, a dramatic ruffle overlay for extra romance, or a delicate micro ruffle along the neckline and waist for a vintage-inspired touch. Pair any of these bodices with a gathered half-circle skirt in vintage midi or maxi length, depending on your style and fabric. In this tutorial, we'll be sewing both the simple bodice and the ruffle overlay version, so you can see each option come together before choosing which to pair with your skirt. Before we get started, I will note the type of elastic used in the back panel, whether it's woven non-roll or soft knit elastic, can significantly affect how the bodice fits and feels. So it's recommended, as with any pattern, to sew a muslin of the simple bodice first, to test the fit and make sure your elastic is just right before cutting into your final fabric. And now let's get started sewing your dream version of Florence. Here is the wrong side of my main bodice front piece. I've marked my bust darts and the lower darts, and I'm going to pin them in place. For each of the darts, sew from the outside edge to the point, leaving thread tails at the point so you can tie them in knots. Trim the bust dart seam allowances to 1/8 of an inch. Repeat all of these steps to form the darts for your lining bodice front piece. Press the bust dart seam allowance for the lining piece upward. Press the bust dart seam allowance for the main piece downward. Then press the lower darts for the main and lining toward the outer raw edges. Fold your spaghetti strap piece in half, right sides together. Sew the long raw edge from one side to the other with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Trim the seam allowance by about half. Use your preferred turning tool to turn your strap right side out. I'm using a small safety pin. Repeat to create all 4 spaghetti straps and give them a good press. For a quick and clean finish for each end of each strap, tie the raw edge in a knot. Leave the opposite raw edges as they are to be attached to the bodice. Place the main bodice back side pieces on top of the bodice front main. Right sides together and pin those side raw edges. Sew both seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Repeat to attach the side pieces to the bodice lining as well. Place one short raw edge of each of your spaghetti straps at each of the peaks on the bodice main piece. Pin in place. Baste each strap in place. Place the lining bodice on top of the main, right sides together. Pin in place along the entire top edge. Sew across with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, maintaining the seam allowance to square off the top corners of the straps. Trim and clip the seam allowance with scissors or use pinking shears. Now we're going to understitch the lining, turning the lining up and away from the main bodice, then sewing the lining to the seam allowance underneath all the way across. At the front straps, you will need to stop and start your stitching on either side of the straps. Place your main and lining bodice back middle pieces right sides together and pin along the top edge. Sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. Once the seam is pressed open, place these two pieces wrong sides together and press the top seam. On the lining side, we're going to draw the lines to form the casings. The first line will be 3/4 of an inch away from the top folded edge. Then we'll draw another line 3/4 of an inch above the bottom raw edge. And another line 3/4 of an inch above that line. Mark yourself a point right in the center of these two casings. Then from the center marking, draw a line 3/8 of an inch above and 3/8 of an inch below that marking. Sew through both layers along each of your lines from one side to the other, back stitching along the outer edges. Cut your 1/2 inch wide elastic for each tier according to the measurements provided in the pattern instructions. Lace each of your elastics through the channels with a bodkin. Securing each side of the elastic in place with a pin. Baste each edge of the elastic in place. Here is my front bodice piece with the main and lining fabrics separated away from each other. Place the elasticated back piece right sides together with the main bodice. Pin in place. Then baste this seam. Fold down the lining so that it's right sides together with the lining side of the back bodice piece. Pin in place. Sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Turn this section right side out and repeat for the other side. Opening out those main and lining pieces once again, placing that center back panel right sides together with the main bodice and basting in place. Then fold down the bodice lining so it's right sides together with the center back and pin in place. Then sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and turn the bodice right side out. Turn the top raw edge of the flutter sleeve piece to the wrong side by 1/2 of an inch, then by an additional 1/2 of an inch. Edge stitch in place along the bottom folded edge to create your casing. With your 3/8 inch elastic cut to the length provided in the pattern instructions, lace the elastic through the casing and pin both edges. Baste both edges of the elastic to secure. Place the side overlay piece right sides together with the flutter sleeve. Aligning your notches and pin in place. Note that the top of the side overlay piece will extend a 1/2 of an inch beyond the finished edge of the flutter sleeve. Sew in place with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to trim this seam allowance by 1/2. Then I'll finish the seam allowance. Press the seam allowances toward the side piece, then repeat to create both sets of corresponding pieces. Place the opposite raw edge of the flutter sleeve right sides together with the bodice front overlay. Pin in place so that once again the raw edge of the overlay extends a 1/2 of an inch beyond the finished edge of the flutter sleeve. Sew both seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, trim the seam in half, and finish the raw edges just as we did in the previous step. Press your finished seams toward the bodice. Place the wrong side of your bodice overlay onto the right side of your front bodice piece. Pin in place along the center raw edges. Note that the raw edges of the bodice front will extend a 1/2 inch beyond the finished edge of the bodice overlay. Baste these pieces together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Place 2 of your straps right sides together with the bodice overlay, aligning the raw edges with the squared off section of the bodice front, centering and pinning in place. Baste in place. Fold and pin your sleeves toward the middle of the bodice for the next step, and pin them in place. Place your front bodice lining right sides together with your main front bodice. Pin in place along the top edges. Sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, maintaining the seam allowance to square off the top strap sections. Trim the seam and clip into the curves with scissors or use pinking shears. We're going to understitch the lining by turning the lining away from the main bodice piece, then sewing the lining to the seam allowance underneath with about 1/8 inch seam allowance. You will have to start and stop your stitches on either side of the strap. Turn everything right side out, give your understitched seams a good press, then set this front bodice aside. Place the bodice back, middle, main, and lining pieces right sides together and pin along the top edge. Sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. Now that seam is sewn and pressed open, fold it in half once more so these pieces are wrong sides together, and press the top seam. To form our casings, first we'll draw our stitching lines. From the top folded edge on the lining side, I'm going to draw a line straight across from side to side, 3/4 inch away from the top folded edge. Then I'll draw another line 3/4 inch away from the bottom raw edge, and another line 3/4 inch above that line. Find and mark the center point between these two casings. Draw 2 lines, one 3/8 inch above your marking and another 3/8 inch below the marking. Sew along your stitching lines from one side to the other, back stitching at each outer edge. Cut each of your 1/2 inch wide elastics to their specific lengths as directed in the pattern instructions. Secure the edges of the elastic with the bodkin and lace the elastic through each channel, securing each end of your elastic with a pin. Baste each end of the elastic to secure. Place the main bodice back side pieces right sides together with the bodice back middle piece. Align the side and bottom edges and pin in place. Note that the upper raw edges of the side back piece do extend beyond the finished edge of the center piece. Sew these seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Place the bodice back side lining pieces right sides together with the bodice back middle lining piece. Pin those seams as before. Sew these seams through all layers with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Open the side pieces away from the center piece and give those seams a good press. Place 2 of your bodice ruffle and sleeve flutter pieces right sides together and pin one of the short side edges. Open out these pieces away from each other and place another of your bodice ruffle and sleeve flutter pieces right sides together with this short edge and pin. Open out this piece so the right side faces you. Place the last of these 4 pieces right sides together with this piece and pin. Sew each of these 3 seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges. To hem the bottom edge of this long piece, we'll fold that bottom raw edge to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch, then once more by an additional 1/4 of an inch, and edge stitch along the upper inner fold straight across. Now along the top raw edge of this piece, we're going to sew basting stitches from one side to the other, leaving tails of thread on both sides so you have threads to pull for gathering. Pull your basting stitches to gather this piece. Here is my bodice overlay piece opened out away from the bodice at the main seam. I've marked the center raw edge of the bodice overlay with a pin. I'll place the center seam of the ruffle right sides together with the center of the overlay and pin in place. Then continue pinning the ruffle along both sides of the bodice overlay and sleeve, distributing the gathers evenly. Once you have the ruffle pinned all the way around to the sleeve and overlay, we're going to sew in place with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, then finish the raw edges. So here is my bodice overlay attached to the bodice and the ruffle. And I've pressed my finished ruffle seam upward. For the side outer raw edges of the overlay piece, we're going to press that finished edge to the wrong side by 1/8 of an inch, then roll and press once more by an additional 1/8 of an inch. Then we'll edge stitch that folded edge in place. Repeat for both outer edges. Open out the main and lining back bodice pieces away from each other. Place the wrong side of the back overlay piece onto the right side of the back main piece. The finished outer edge of the overlay will land in the middle of the strap placement area. Pin in place. Baste to secure. I'll place one of the raw unfinished edges of one of my remaining strap pieces right sides together with the back bodice, centering it at the top peak, and pin in place. Flip over the center back unit so that the side back panel of the main and lining are right sides together. Pin along the top seam. Sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, turn these pieces right side out and repeat for the opposite side. Now the center back panel is complete and we can finish sewing our side seams. Open out the main and lining of the back pieces away from each other. Also open out the main and lining of the front piece away from each other. Then place the front and back main and lining pieces right sides together. Pin together first at the underarm seam, then both sides. Sew straight across the seam from the bottom of the main fabric across the seam to the bottom of the lining fabric with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Turn that right side out and repeat to construct the opposite side seam. Place your front and back skirt pieces right sides together along the side seam and pin in place. Repeat to pin both side seams. Sew both side seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges in the same way as you've done previously. Place your skirt ruffle pieces right sides together and pin along the short seam. Now that that's pinned, I'll open out the ruffle piece so that it's right side up and place another ruffle panel right sides together with this side. And pin. Repeat to attach and pin your remaining ruffle panel piece. Now that all of our ruffle pieces are connected, I'll take the remaining short edge of one ruffle and pin it right sides together with the remaining short edge of the ruffle piece that we started with. Sew each of your 4 seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges. So here are the 4 ruffle seams sewn and finished. And our ruffle piece is now one giant loop. Along the top edge of the ruffle all the way around, we're going to sew basting stitches within the seam allowance. It's easier to gather each of the panels separately from one seam to the other, then leave a thread tail and start a new set of stitches to gather the next panel. Again, from seam to seam, leaving a tail and starting on the next panel. Continue for each of the 4 panels. This way each section will be easier to gather. Here is the bottom raw edge of my skirt, and I've gone ahead and marked the center front and center back just using pins. I'm going to place the gathered edge of the ruffle right sides together with the bottom raw edge of the skirt. I'll start by pinning one of the seams of the ruffle at the center point that I've marked at the bottom of the skirt. Then I'll match the next seam of the ruffle with the side seam of the skirt and pin in place. Then I'll match the next seam of my ruffle with the center back and pin in place. Then repeat to match and pin the remaining seams of the ruffle and the side seam of the skirt. Pull the basting stitches of the ruffle so that they fit within each pinned section and pin in place. Now that I have the ruffle pinned to the skirt all the way around, sew in place all the way around with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish your raw edges. To hem the bottom of the skirt, I'm going to fold the raw edge to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch, then by an additional 1/4 of an inch, and sew along the upper inner fold all the way around. To gather the top of the skirt, I've gone ahead and sewn my basting stitches, once again sewing them from seam to seam, breaking up the stitches and leaving tails of thread at both seams. This will make gathering both sections easier. Gather the top of the skirt so that it fits the bottom of your bodice. Now, whether you've sewn the simple bodice or the bodice overlay option, we're ready to attach the bodice to the skirt. Begin by pinning the bottom of the bodice to the top of the skirt right sides together. Align the side seams and pin in place. As you're pinning the back bodice piece to the skirt, note that you will be stretching that back bodice elastic to fit. Pin in place. Then do the same to pin the bodice along the front to the skirt. Now we can sew our gathered skirt to the bottom of the bodice with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges all the way around. And now the dress is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.